house was quieter than usual that night. Ethan looked out the window of the room, watching his parents' car disappear in the road darkness. They would go to a charity dinner in the city and come back late. For him, it would be a quiet night without anyone around to bother. Finally a little peace, he muttered as he threw himself on the couch, taking control of the video game. For about an hour, everything went as expected. Ethan played, with the sound of effects filling the environment. But then he heard something. A low, almost imperceptible sound coming from the floor below. It must be the wind. He shrugged and turned his attention to the screen, but could not concentrate. His gaze was constantly turned to the door of the room, as if something was different. Shortly after, he heard the sound again, now clearer, steps. Slow, steady, and they stopped right under the ladder. Ethan swallowed dry. "Hello?" called, with the voice hesitant. No answer. He turned off the game, standing still, trying to hear better. After a few seconds, the house went back to a grave silence. He laughed nervously. "Man, you're seeing things where there are none." But when Ethan got up to go to the kitchen, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house, breaking the stillness abruptly. He froze. Who would knock on the door at that time? Slowly he walked to the window beside the door, pulling gently on the curtain to spy. There was no one. The bell rang again, longer and more insistent. His heart pounded. He opened the door suddenly, hoping to catch someone by surprise, but the courtyard was empty. Only the cold wind swayed the branches of the trees. Foul play, he thought, closing the door and turning the lock. He took a step back, and at that moment the outside light blinked 1, 2, 3 times before it went out completely. Then he heard a voice, low and drawn, calling his name. "Ethan is." He stopped on the 3rd step. The sound came from below, in the same direction as the previous steps. It was the voice of his mother. "Mother?" he asked, his lips shaking. But he knew it was impossible. His parents were miles away. The voice repeated, this time louder, and now it seemed to come from the kitchen. "Ethan, come here." The cell phone's flashlight started to blink. Something was profoundly wrong. He felt an inexplicable cold rising up the spine, and his mind tried to find some logic for what was happening. Without thinking, he ran to his room and locked the door, letting the light of the cell phone illuminate the space. On the other side, in the corridor, he heard a slight shuffle of feet, as if someone was climbing the stairs, slowly, very slowly. The voice sounded again, now closer. "Open the door, Ethan." He didn't answer. He just pressed his phone against his chest, his heart pounding so hard that he could barely breathe. The silence came back, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the air had been drained from the house, as if the night itself were watching him. And then he realized, something was trying to get in. Ethan held his phone tightly, trying to calm down. The voice had stopped, but the silence did not comfort him. On the contrary, it seemed loaded, heavy, as if the whole house was holding its breath. The light of the lantern flickered, threatening to go out. He looked around his room, looking for something he could use as protection. His attention turned to the baseball bat against the wall. He grabbed it, trying to ignore the tremor in his hands. Outside in the corridor, the ground raged. Slowly, as if something was walking from side to side, waiting. And then the door of his room began to shake. First, it was a light knock. Then, stronger blows, as if someone were trying to break in. The voice returned, now distorted, echoing with a tone that was almost human, but loaded with something wrong. "Ethan, open." He did not answer, holding the stick more strongly. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. Now the only thing he could hear was his own panting breath. The cell phone light went out. "No, no, no," he whispered, pressing the buttons frantically, but the flashlight did not light. Darkness took hold of the room, oppressive, almost tangible. Something moved. Not in the corridor, but inside the room. Ethan froze. He felt the air get cold, every hair on his body shuddering. The feeling was clear, he wasn't alone. "Who's there?" he asked, the voice breaking at the end. In the corner of the room, near the closet, something began to form. It was a shadow, dense and pulsating, that seemed to wriggle like living smoke. Ethan tried to back off, but his back was already against the wall. Suddenly the shadow disappeared, as if it had never been there. The room looked empty again, but Ethan knew it was a lie. In despair, he unlocked the door and ran out into the hall. The ground creaked under his feet, but now it seemed higher, as if the whole house was echoing the sound. He quickly went down the stairs, stumbling over the last step and falling on his knees on the cold floor of the room. He needed to get out of there. Ran to the front door and turned the handle, but it did not open. He pulled hard, but it was as if the door was stuck by something on the other side. "Please let me out," he cried, banging the door with his bat. Behind him, the TV turned on by itself. The screen blinked, showing static for a few seconds before forming an image. Ethan turned slowly, his heart racing. On the screen he saw the room where he was, but there was something else. In the left corner, where there should be only an empty chair, there was a seated figure. The entity. It was high, shrouded in darkness that seemed to devour the light around it. His eyes were glowing a faint red, fixed directly on the television camera. And then, as if he knew that he was looking, the figure stood up. Ethan felt the air around him cool even more, as if his own environment was reacting to that presence. He looked back at the chair in the corner of the room. It was empty. But when he looked back at the television, the picture had disappeared from the screen. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house. First upstairs, then in the corridor, and then a few meters away behind the locked basement door. The basement handle started to rotate. Ethan yelled, running toward the kitchen. He needed to find a way out, anything. But as he went through the door, he saw something that stopped him. On the table was a framed picture. He had never seen that photo before. It was from his family, but something was wrong. His parents were there, smiling, but there was another figure in the picture. The entity was in the middle of them. And then a husky, deep and drawn voice sounded behind him, so close that he felt the cold air in his neck. "You can't run away, Ethan." He turned slowly, with the stick raised. Ethan turned the stick toward the voice, but found only the void. The kitchen was dark except for the faint moonlight coming through the window. He swallowed dry, feeling the sweat running down his face. The steps began again, echoing through the house. Only this time they came from all directions. It was as if the entity was everywhere, surrounding him. "What do you want from me?" cried, despair overflowing in his voice. The answer came in a whisper dragged. "You." The kitchen lights flickered and went out, plunging everything into absolute darkness. Ethan heard a sound, as if something heavy was being dragged on the ground, coming towards him. He ran into the room, stumbling over the furniture, trying to find any way out. The front door, which before would not open, was now half open. The sight of the night outside seemed an invitation. He ran towards the exit, but when he reached the door, it closed tightly, almost crushing his fingers. The laughter of the entity echoed through the house, guttural and deep, reverberating like an invisible wave that made Ethan's chest vibrate. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, feeling the anger and fear mix. A dense shadow appeared at the top of the ladder, looking at him. It was a humanoid form, but impossible to describe completely, as if its existence was something that should not be seen. The red eyes shone in the darkness. "This house belongs to me," said the voice, coming directly from the shadow. "And now, you also belong." Ethan backed up, but tripped on the carpet and fell down to the ground. The entity slowly descended the steps, each step sounding like a drum beat. He tried to get up, but felt an invisible force pressing him against the ground. His thoughts ran, seeking any way to fight. Remembered the stories his mother told about how her great-grandmother believed in protection rituals. Ethan never paid attention to it, but now anything was a chance. With difficulty he muttered, "You don't control me. I'm not yours." The entity laughed, louder now, and the house seemed to shake with the sound. "You have no choice." Then Ethan realized, the house was not just alive, it was the entity. The whole place was a body for that thing. He needed to leave, but how? On the floor next to him, he saw the baseball bat. With a desperate idea, Ethan grabbed it and, with all his strength, struck the nearest window. The glass broke into 1,000 pieces, and the cold night wind invaded the room. Without thinking, he climbed up the doorstop, ignoring the cuts on his hands, and jumped out. As he fell to the ground outside, he rolled on the wet grass and stood up wobbly. The house looked darker than ever, as if the structure itself was watching him. And then he heard the voice again, not from inside the house, but behind him. "You can't run from me."
I was home alone that night as usual. There was nothing special. The wind was gently beating in the windows, and the distant sound of the city seemed almost a whisper, muffled by the loneliness of my home. It was an ordinary Thursday night, and I was relaxing on the couch, trying to disconnect from work. I took my phone to see if there was any message. Nothing. I looked at social networks for a few minutes without finding anything interesting. It was then that I saw a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. I hesitated, but curious, opened. What I saw made me frown. "You still have the pet dog, right? He's sleeping on the couch now." I was a little confused. How did anyone know that? My dog, Pingo, was actually on the couch next to me, sleeping as described. I had not spoken to anyone about him today, nor mentioned where he was. Just left the message there without giving much importance. Maybe it was a hoax or a mistake. It wasn't the first time something like this happened. Then another message came. "Today you wore the red sweater. It's quite comfortable, isn't it? I can smell it." My skin shuddered. How could anyone know that? I had not shared anything about the sweater with anyone. My stomach got a knot, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a mistake or some kind of bad joke. Ignored the message and put my phone back on the table. But instead of feeling calm, a strange sensation began to invade me. It was not only the content of the message that bothered me, but the tone, as if the person was really watching me. I felt vulnerable, exposed. When I took the phone again to check the time, I saw that there was another message. "You're up now. You're going to the kitchen, aren't you?" My body stopped. The message described exactly what I was doing. I was going to the kitchen to get something to drink. I looked back, as if I expected to see someone there, but the house was silent, empty, except for me and the sound of Pingo breathing quietly. I didn't want to believe what was happening, so I deleted the message and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a coincidence or some system failure. But then the phone vibrated again. "I can see you. You're looking at the phone screen now. Don't hide." My heart popped. I froze for a second, eyes fixed on the screen. I knew there was no one else in the house, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. Something in me began to shake. It was not possible. How could anyone know what I was doing? And worse, how could they know so precisely what happened in my house? I got up from the chair, leaving my phone on the table, and started walking around the room trying to rationalize. It should be some kind of well-done trot. A friend playing with me, maybe, but who would do something like that? And why? I felt a chill and stopped in the middle of the room. I looked around. Everything seemed to be in its proper place. But something was strange. Something was different. What exactly, I could not say. But the environment around me seemed denser, heavier. I was being watched and could not figure out where that look came from. That night seemed to drag in a strange way. Every sound in the house, every movement of Pingo, made me jump. The phone was on the table, still on, and the screen light blinked with each message received. I tried to ignore it, but the restlessness grew. Could not just let them pass. Finally, I decided to take a look. The first message was like the previous ones. An observation about something I had just done. "You didn't notice, but you left the light on from the balcony. The window is open, and the wind is coming in. Isn't it bothering you?" I looked out onto the balcony. The window was indeed half open, but how could anyone know that? I was so engrossed in the messages that I didn't even notice. I went to the window and closed it, but something inside me could not calm down. I was beginning to realize that there was no longer any way to simply ignore it. The messages were getting more and more personal, and the coincidences more frequent. I turned off the screen and tried to distract myself by picking up a book that was on the coffee table. But the feeling of being observed did not disappear. The sound of Pingo moving in bed made me jump every time I snapped. I wasn't alone. That was clear to me. The second message arrived a few minutes later, as if waiting for the right moment. "Do you feel safe in your home? I saw you looking at the kitchen door, as if you were waiting for someone to come in." I was taken by a shiver. Had not looked at the kitchen door, but the moment I read those words, my mind automatically went there. The feeling that something was wrong intensified. I was completely alone. There was no one else in the house. There should be no one who knows the details of my behavior, my thoughts, how I felt. My hands were shaking when I started to answer, not knowing why. Maybe it was an impulse, an attempt to understand what was happening. "Who are you?" I waited a few seconds before looking back at the screen, but the answer did not take long to arrive. "You already know who I am. I'm where you least expect." I got up from the chair, almost dropping my phone in the process. The feeling of panic increased. What did that mean? How did the person know? I looked around the room, but the house seemed normal, silent. I looked again at the doors, the windows, the dark corners of the house. Everything was as usual, but that sense of presence, that something or someone was there, watching me, could not be ignored. The fear spread within me, slow and accurate. It was when something strange happened. I heard a sound coming from the corridor. A light snap, as if someone had stepped on the ground. I froze. The silence came back immediately, but the fear I felt was palpable. What was happening? Was I becoming paranoid? Or was I really being watched? I decided to investigate. I took an emergency lamp, a small flashlight that always kept by the sofa, and went to the hallway. Each step of mine seemed to echo louder than normal, the sound of my breath becoming more audible. The house was empty. I checked the bathroom, the office, the bedroom, and even the basement, all in silence. Nothing was out of place. But when I came back to the room, something stopped me halfway. My phone screen was on again. It was another message. You looked at the mirror in the hallway when you walked past it. I was behind you, only you didn't see. The air was lacking me. I was with the lantern in my hands, still frozen in the middle of the corridor, and a wave of ice ran through my spine. The message talked about something that had happened minutes before, something I did not notice as I passed through the mirror. I felt a presence behind me, as if someone was really there, looking. I turned quickly, but the house was empty. Still, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something or someone was there. I was being watched. I was being watched, and there was no place where I could hide. I didn't know what else to do. Every time the phone vibrated, a wave of dread took me completely. The messages were becoming more detailed, more threatening, and the feeling that something was lurking, waiting for me, had never been stronger. I could no longer distinguish between paranoia and reality. The idea of being observed from somewhere in the house haunted me like a shadow, and the pops coming from the empty corners seemed to intensify. I went to the couch and sat down, hands shaking, trying to organize my thoughts. I needed to find a logical explanation, something that would make me come to my senses, but the words in the messages did not let me. Something was very wrong, something I could not control. The phone screen lit up again, and unintentionally I already knew what was coming next. A message that once again described what I was doing at the time. It was as if they were inside my mind, following every step of mine. You're sitting on the couch, holding your phone with shaking hands. But don't worry, I'm not that easy to catch. I almost screamed. How could they know that? I looked around, at the door of the room, at the window, at the corridor, but everything was silent, still. The feeling of being observed was unbearable. I could no longer distinguish whether the words on the screen were referring to what was happening at the time, or if they were a reflection of something that was about to happen. I started to go around the house, more agitated. It seemed that my breath accelerated with each new sound, with each new message that arrived. I tried to turn on the lights, but each time I did that, a new message came out. You lit the kitchen lights, but the smell of food in the air doesn't come from there. It's something that is closer to you. I stopped in the middle of the corridor. The smell was real, something sweet and seasick, something I didn't recognize. There was nothing cooking. The house was quiet, and I was alone. I stood still, eyes fixed on the corners of the house, trying to locate where the smell came from. But what terrified me the most was the feeling that I was no longer alone. Went to the kitchen, following the aroma that seemed to intensify. There was nothing there. The stove was off, the drawers closed, but the feeling that something was moving inside my house continued. The fear began to take physical form, and I could no longer control the anxiety that dominated me. Then the last message arrived. I'm at your house, Lucy. I'm closer than you think. I was so scared that I dropped my phone on the floor. Fear turned into absolute dread. How could anyone be in my house without me noticing? How could someone be so close to me? My head was spinning with these questions, but there were no answers. The only thing I knew for sure was that I was being watched, and that the person watching me was not someone I knew, nor something I could understand. I ran into the room, locking the door behind me, my body trembling with dread. The room was empty, but the feeling that something was there, right in front of me, became unbearable. I approached the window and looked out, hoping to find some explanation, anything that would give me some kind of security. But what I saw froze me. The light on the balcony, which I had closed earlier, was lit again. And for a brief moment, a shadow moved, stretching along the wall, as if it was watching me. The final message arrived shortly after. "I can see you now. Don't try to run away." Panic took hold of me. It didn't matter what was real or imaginary anymore. I wasn't alone anymore, and now there was no safe place left. Fear consumed me from the inside out. My mind was weak, the thoughts fragmented, and the feeling of being observed did not leave me alone. The house, which was once a safe haven, now looked like a maze of closed doors and windows that opened into an abyss of uncertainty. I tried to lock all the doors, hide in corners of the house, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't make a difference. Something was there, something I didn't understand, something that wasn't just human. My body was cold and my breathing heavy. I leaned my head against the door of the room, trying to control the panic. My phone was still on the floor, the screen lit up, but I couldn't touch it. It was now a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded me. I knew that the final message had been a warning, and every second, the feeling that something or someone was waiting for the right moment to appear intensified. That's when the sound first came out. The snap, light almost imperceptible, something moving down the hall. My heart popped. I looked at the phone and, with trembling hands, took it back. The message was already there. I already entered, "Lucy. Now only you are missing." I let go of my phone with no strength to continue. All I wanted was to get out of there, run to the street, but what was waiting for me outside? And more importantly, who or what was watching me? I looked out the window once again. I saw nothing, but the sweet smell was still in the air, stronger now. Something I could not identify, but that made me feel a deep restlessness. I looked out the door of the room. That feeling of being watched was at its peak. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Someone or something was there. The sound of steps, light, almost imperceptible, began to approach. I did not know what to do. My feet were heavy as lead, but a part of me did not want to face what was about to happen. I stood still, hearing the sound approaching. It was as if the house was breathing with me. Each floor snap a heavy breath, each movement a warning. Then the door opened, not with violence, but with a terrifying calm. I did not move. I could not. Something stopped me. Something held me, paralyzed me with a deep fear, visceral. A shadow entered the room. It was not a person. It was not human at all. The figure was indistinct, a black blur, but I could feel the presence. It was as if she were materializing before me, taking shape, but still undetermined. The air became heavy, and the light of the lamp flickered briefly, as if electricity was sucked into that thing. The shadow didn't talk. I didn't need to. I knew what she wanted, what she expected, and somehow, deep down, I already knew who she was. Something that was there, but I never knew to see. Maybe it was something in my mind, a reflection of my deepest fears, or perhaps it was something much older, much more real than I could comprehend. The figure approached slowly. With each step, the shadow seemed to distort, as if it was crossing its own space and time. Couldn't breathe. My mind was in panic, fighting reality, trying to understand what was happening, but the truth was simple and terrifying. I was no longer in control. I had never been. The shadow bent down to me, and with a low whisper, almost inaudible, said, "Now you finally see me." It was then that everything went out. I woke up hours later, sitting on the floor of my room, my phone still in my hand. The house was quiet, but something was different. I looked around, trying to process what had happened. The lights were out, the air was dense, and the feeling of being watched was still present, but in a more subtle way. I stood up slowly, trying to keep calm, and looked out the window again. The light on the balcony was off. Everything was quiet, but I knew that feeling of presence would never leave me again. I didn't know who or what was watching me, but one thing was certain. He was still there, somewhere, waiting for me. I have always been the type that needs a time alone to get together, to breathe. So when I finally got a free weekend away from work and any responsibility, I didn't think twice before accepting the idea of spending a few days in a secluded house. A friend had told me about this place, an old house in the countryside, which was already in her family for generations. She assured me that it would be the perfect refuge to rest and put my thoughts in order. The promise of absolute silence and peace was what attracted me, as if all I needed was isolation to regain balance. I arrived at the house in the afternoon, when the sun was still high, but the house had a strange aura. It was large, dark wood with wide windows that let the daylight in, but in a way that made everything look blurry, as if the light were afraid to touch the old furniture. The place was too quiet, the kind of silence that sounds wrong. There were no bird sounds, no buzzing insects in the air, just a dense calm, as if something was waiting. The house had a peculiar smell of aged wood mixed with something stronger, like the smell of history. I entered the front door, which squeaked when it opened, and soon came across a large living room. The walls were covered with dark wood panels, which made the house seem even more lonely, as if it was trying to hide the secrets it kept. I put my suitcase on the floor and started to explore the place, trying to get used to silence. I passed through the living room, where old sofas were laid out in an uncomfortably tidy way, as if they were waiting for someone who would never arrive. In the hallway, the wood of the floor creaked under my feet every step. When I passed through a door at the end of the corridor, I realized it was a room. It seemed to be intact, but it did not seem that anyone had entered there for years. A layer of dust covered the furniture, and the bed was lined with white sheets, dusty, as if waiting for a visitor who would never appear. I didn't feel like going in. Something about that room made me hesitate. I decided to go upstairs to choose a room for myself. It was brighter up there, with a window overlooking the front garden, where the trees were starting to lose their leaves, sign that autumn was approaching. The room I chose was simple but nice. I put my suitcase next to the bed and sat down to rest a bit. That's when I heard. First, I thought it was the wind, but listening more carefully, I realized that they were low laughs, as if someone was having fun somewhere in the house. It was not something that could be confused with the sound of something normal. These little laughs were different, as if they were coming from within the walls or from somewhere far away from home. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was just too tired. Lay in bed, trying to relax, but the sound persisted. Came from somewhere upstairs. From that room, I think. I stood up, determined to investigate. But as I opened the door of my room, the house was silent again. The kind of silence that seemed even more oppressive. I took a deep breath and decided to ignore what I had heard. After all, I was alone there. Could be nothing. Went back to bed, but the sound came back. It was subtle, but it was there, like a muted laugh. She seemed to move through the corridor, always in the distance, as if she was sneaking through the walls and trying not to be noticed. I didn't want to believe that something like this was happening. So I put the pillow over my head and tried to force myself to sleep. But the laughter continued. It didn't seem natural. She was old. She was like something that had lived there for a long time. I knew I shouldn't, but something inside me wanted to investigate. Something was calling me. The night came quickly, and the house seemed to close on me, as if the darkness extended longer than usual, swallowing all corners. Went to the kitchen to make something simple to eat, trying to ignore the strange feeling that haunted me. But I could not help noticing that, as I moved around the house, something was wrong. The lights flickered occasionally, and the air was dense, as if something was out of place. I ate quickly, feeling a shiver running through my spine. I was alone, but the feeling that something or someone else was there with me did not leave me. When I finished, I decided to take a look at the old photos that were spread on a corner table in the room. They were photos of a family, but it was not any family. The place was my friend's, yes, but some of those images seemed familiar, as if I had seen them somewhere before. The faces were vague, and the light in the photos seemed blurred by time. I looked at the walls of the house and noticed that some of these photos were there, framed, spread out as if they were part of an old mural of souvenirs. What bothered me, however, was a particular photo. A picture of a young woman, dark hair and piercing eyes, with a look that seemed to fix on me, as if she knew me. That image caused me unspeakable discomfort. I could not stop looking at it. Maybe it was just the feeling of being alone in such a big and old house. But I couldn't get away with the idea that the woman in the photo knew something I didn't. Something about me. Something about what was going on there. After a while, I decided it was time to sleep. The room was colder now, and I could not help but notice that the silence, which until then seemed comforting, was more present, as if something filled it. Before I lay down, I closed the door of the room, but when the light went out and I was lying in bed, the laughter came back. This time it was clearer. It wasn't a distant laugh, but something closer, coming from upstairs, the old room. I knew what it meant. Couldn't be just imagination. It was too late to ignore what was happening. So I stood up, hesitant but determined to find out what was going on. The corridor was in shadows. Every step I took made the wood creak, as if the house was complaining of my presence. The laughter was higher now. I knew it was coming from that room I hadn't used. That room which was supposed to be nothing more than an empty space, but seemed to call my name, as if it wanted to reveal something to me. The door to the room was half open. There was no reason not to open, but as I approached, the laughter became sharper, more precise. It was a voice, a female voice, but it wasn't just any woman. It was something older, something that made my stomach wrap. I put my hand on the doorknob and turned slowly. The sound of the door opening was like a sigh, breaking the silence. Inside, the room was dark, but the shadows seemed denser, more solid than elsewhere in the house. I approached the window, hoping it was just the reflection of the moonlight, but what I found was a feeling of emptiness. The room was empty, except for a chair facing the wall. When I looked back, I noticed that the bed was slightly messy, as if someone had recently been lying there. The laughter stopped suddenly. All I heard now was the sound of my own heart, beating hard in my chest, echoing in silence. I quickly closed the door, but something stopped me. I didn't know what it was, but it was as if the room was watching me, or rather, as if someone was waiting for me there. The next morning, I looked for more answers. I found an old box hidden in the back of the hallway closet. When I opened it, I found something that made me even more disturbed. A collection of old letters and documents. What shocked me most was not the content of the letters, but the name that appeared in them, my grandmother's name. But my grandmother had never told me about this house. She never mentioned anything about a distant past. As I tried to understand what those letters were trying to tell me, a growing sense of fear took hold of me. What scared me the most was the idea that the house knew who I was, knew something about my family, something that was buried in the past, something that apparently was trying to get back. I knew that I was closer to the truth, but what awaited me at the bottom of that story? The sun was setting when the house seemed, once again, to close around me. The air was heavy, laden with a sense of imminent revelation. After I found the letters and read those words that seemed to call me back in time, I could no longer ignore the fact that the house was connected to my family in a way that I did not fully understand. I knew something was wrong, that those letters, with their mysterious and incomplete content, were leading me down a path I wasn't prepared to follow. I decided that I needed more answers. The only way to get it was to investigate more deeply what was buried there, something my grandmother, for some reason, preferred to leave in the past, something that was being revealed to me gradually, as if the house itself was trying to force me to understand. I spent the afternoon walking around the house, examining every little corner, every detail. It was no longer the kind of carefree walk I had taken when I arrived. Now, I was looking for something that connected the loose ends. And it was in the living room that I found what I was looking for. Behind a shelf full of dusty books, there was a slightly displaced wooden wall. My breath failed for a moment. I knew there was something there, but the idea of messing with that space that had clearly been closed for a long time left me apprehensive. I pulled the shelf carefully, and the wall behind it opened slowly, as if waiting to be discovered. Inside the small space, I found a tiny door, almost hidden, that led to the basement of the house. The air seemed colder as I approached the ladder that descended into darkness. My body cried out for me to stop, so that I would go back to the comfort of my room and forget everything that was happening. But I could not. Something inside me, An unexplained force pushed me forward. The feeling that the answer I was looking for was down there was too strong to be ignored. I went down slowly, my hands trembling slightly. Each step creaked under my weight, and I felt more isolated as the natural light of the house faded behind me. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, the darkness was almost total except for a weak lamp hanging from the ceiling. She blinked intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls that seemed to move. It was then that I heard again, the laughter. She was coming from somewhere in the basement, but this time it was more than a laugh. It was a voice, a familiar voice. I knew I heard her before. It was the same voice I had heard the night before, the same laugh, but now it was clearer, sharper. I could no longer ignore. It was as if the house was breathing with a soul of its own, as if it was calling me. The voice whispered my name, soft but clear. My name. Panic took hold of me. My breathing accelerated, and I could hardly keep myself standing. What was going on? Who was there? How did that voice know who I was? Suddenly the ground below me shook, and a feeling of cold ran through my spine. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. It was then that I saw, in the darkness, right before me, a figure appeared. She was leaning against one of the walls in the basement, partially hidden by the shadow, but her eyes shone in the darkness. It was the woman's eyes in the picture, the same woman. She was there, before me, staring at me with an empty gaze, as if she recognized me. She opened her mouth, but there was no sound. Instead, a cold wind blew through the basement, making the lamps flash violently. My vision was clouded. I felt the pressure of something old and deep approaching, something that had been stuck there for so long waiting to be found, something related to my family, something that my grandmother had hidden, something my own story was trying to tell me, and that now could not be ignored anymore. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there and forget everything. But at the same time, a part of me knew that there was no turning back. The house, with its cold walls and disturbing history, would not let me leave. She wanted me to know the truth. The figure disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving me with a feeling of emptiness. But when I looked down, something caught my attention. On the floor, beside the ladder, was a crumpled piece of paper. I crouched down, my heart beating hard, and unrolled it with trembling hands. It was a diary, the diary of someone I knew very well, my grandmother. With my eyes fixed on the yellow words, a feeling of dread invaded me. The words were clear, but their meaning was terrifying. My grandmother had written about a secret, something that happened long before I was born, something the house kept at a very high price, something that was about to return to claim me. I was paralyzed with the diary in my hands, my body trembling, and the feeling of being watched was even stronger now. The basement was quiet again, but a growing pressure hovered in the air, as if the house itself was breathing, hoping that I would understand what was happening. The words in the diary were etched into my mind as an indelible mark. My grandmother had written about the house, about the curse that hung over it, about the events that unfolded long before I was born. But what shocked me the most was the last entry, which seemed addressed to me, even if it did not mention my name. They're coming back. What my mother did, what the house holds, everything we've done to hide. Now you must know. But be careful, dear, because once you understand, you cannot run away. They will come after you as they have come after me, and you will be trapped here, just as we always have been. I couldn't fully process those words. What did my grandmother mean by they? Who were these entities that were returning? And what had my mother done? I couldn't understand, but knew that this was not just a mystery. It was a real threat, something that was already moving, something that was wrapping me in its clutches. When I got up, the sound of laughter came back. Higher, closer. It was no longer coming from the basement, but from the room, from those same walls that seemed to have kept so many secrets. I turned quickly, hoping to see something, but the house was still in complete silence. I ran upstairs, climbing the stairs as fast as my legs would allow. The room where it all started was in front of me. I knew I had to face it once and for all. The house was trying to warn me, was trying to force me to face what was hidden in it. I took a deep breath and opened the door of the room. Inside, the atmosphere was dense, oppressive. The bed was untidy as before, but now the environment was different. The shadows were more intense, denser, and it seemed that I was being watched by something I could not see but felt all the time. I walked to the window and, looking out, I saw something that made me freeze. In the darkness, the moonlight illuminated a figure standing on the edge of the garden where the earth met the forest. The figure was indistinct, but I knew who it was. The woman in the photo, the same woman with piercing eyes. I knew she wasn't just watching, she was waiting. It was at this moment that everything fit together, like a piece of puzzle that finally finds its place. My grandmother, my mother, the house, the story she kept. The woman in the photo, she was not just a member of my family. She was something more, something that had been left behind, something that should have been buried, but now for some reason was coming back. The house was alive somehow, and she wanted to force me to relive the past, to relive my mother's mistake, my grandmother's mistake, the mistake of all who came before me. They tried to forget, but I couldn't. I knew I had to leave, but at the same time I felt that the house would not let me go. When I turned to the door, I saw something in the mirror reflection. In the dirty glass, a shadow approached me. A shadow of a woman, with eyes as dark as night, and an empty smile, like that of someone who had lost the ability to feel. She was coming to me. She knew what I had done, or rather what my family had done. I tried to run, but something held me. The air seemed thick, as if the house was wrapping me in its claws. I cried, but my voice was lost in the darkness. The ground trembled, and the sound of laughter came back, now mixed with a lament, as if the house was crying. Then the door of the room closed itself. The last thing I saw was the figure of the woman, standing before me, and black eyes like coal watching me, waiting. She did not speak, but with her gaze she said everything. There was no escape. I knew the house had won, and that the past, with its secrets, had now come back to collect me.